Good morning. When you go into the Pine Rest Counseling Center, you will see engraved along the top by the doorway these words: "Let us approach God's throne of grace with confidence so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need." This parable by Jesus is about how we respond to God's mercy. That's how he responds to Peter's question. We ask, what does it mean to come into the presence of this mercy? How does it happen? And what is the result? Now, Peter's question was about how often do we need to forgive? And that's how many approach this parable. It's through that lens. How should we deal with forgiving those who have wronged us? But Jesus' answer to Peter's question makes no sense in the framework that Peter asked it. Now, you see, in that time, there was some thinking in rabbinical schools that maybe you should forgive one another 3 times. And Peter was actually raising the bar and saying to Jesus, well, what about 7 times? But Jesus' response shows Peter's asking the wrong question. The real question is, do you understand God's mercy? Have you experienced it? Has it changed you? Now, the background to this parable would be familiar to those who were listening, because in the ancient Mediterranean culture, kings had agents or slaves who ruled over other lower-level slaves, all for the purpose of passing money up through the system, from those who worked the land all the way up to those who then reaped the wealth. But in Jesus' story, the primary servant owes the king an impossible sum. Now, I want you to understand what Jesus was really describing here. 1 denarii is equal at that time to about a day's wage for a day laborer or even a soldier. 1 talent was equal to 6,000 denarii, or about 20 years of wages. 10,000 talents, well, you do the math. That's like the gross national product of a small kingdom. And Jesus uses this extreme exaggeration to show that the servant owed a debt that was completely impossible to pay, despite the servant's pleading to do so. So the king's act of forgiving the debt shows an extraordinary and unthinkable mercy. And if followed, it would create a whole jubilee of debt forgiveness throughout the whole realm. Now, by contrast, the slave owes the forgiven servant 100 denarii. Now, that's realistic. It's a sizable sum, about 3 months' worth of wages, but one could imagine a payment scheme over time to pay it off. So the ungrateful servant's response seems nearly incomprehensible, because his unexpected and undeserved encounter with such extravagant mercy made no impact on his life. Instead, he stops the jubilee flow of mercy and reverts immediately to the unforgiving system of demand, retribution, and punishment. And so the parable presents this question: how do we live in the presence of overflowing mercy? How do we allow it to touch our lives at the core and really change us? Now, I think for some of us, maybe many of us, we really live through our achievements, our accomplishments, our reputation. We're comfortable with those things. I know for me, and I think for others, you get centered around 4 things: self-sufficiency, I could do this on my own. Rational certainty, I've got it all figured out. Pride, maybe verging toward grandiosity, it's really pretty good. And control, mastery, I'm in charge. And these create a kind of protective shell. Now, we believe in mercy, of course, but it's not an inward transforming experience. It's almost like an entitlement. Now, there's a story from the Buddhist tradition that might give us some insight. It's a true story. In Bangkok, Thailand, there was a huge clay statue of the Buddha. In the 1950s, a combination of heat and drought caused it to begin to crack. So monks came to examine the damage. And they looked at the largest crack and then shone a flashlight in. And to their surprise, through the crack, they spotted a reflection of gold. It turned out that a solid gold Buddha was embedded beneath the facade of clay. 600 years earlier, layers of protective clay and plaster were used to cover the gold Buddha and protect it from invading armies. The monks were killed, but the Buddha survived, yet over time its identity was defined by its layers of protective covering, while its true nature was hidden from all. There's a lyric of the late Leonard Cohen, who was actually one of my favorite theologians, that puts it this way: there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. This morning, as we think about this parable, I want us to reflect on the cracks in our life, to embrace the pain, and allow the light of God's mercy to shine and envelop us at our core. Because only the pain we name is available for transformation. And that requires what I like to call a holding space. That's your spiritual infrastructure, constructed using the tools, practices, and disciplines that continually open your life to God's interrogating and redeeming presence. Now, this metaphor of gold, that uncovering gold of one's true identity through an encounter with God's mercy, it's also found in our Christian tradition. You'll probably remember that in the first part of Handel's Messiah, a bass aria proclaims, "He is like a refiner's fire." The text comes from Malachi 3:2. It's often used in lectionary readings during Advent. And it's about this. In ancient times, gold embedded in rocks and dirt was crushed, washed, and then subjected to high temperatures in furnaces, removing the impurities, which were called the dross, revealing its true essence. And listen to this. When a metal was being purified, the goldsmith would know its essence had been revealed when the image of his face was reflected back in the emerging material. Destroying the false protective coverings allows the emergence of what is true. Layers of dross keep you and me from being overwhelmed by God's mercy and from reflecting back the image of God to others. And what does happen when we have those times when God's mercy shines through our pain, that comes through those cracks and fills us with the transforming power of grace? Well, we grasp what forgiveness actually means. And we learn to stop clinging to our protective shells. I think we move from self-sufficiency to belonging, to our bonds in community. From detached, rational certainty, we're drawn to direct connection, God's presence in creation, in song, in communion. From pride and grandiosity, we embrace authenticity. We discover our true self resting in the image of God. And we step away from control and mastery to trust, where grace is not a doctrine, but a way of life. And we're no longer captivated by the world system of retribution, punishment, and revenge. We stop keeping score. Forgiving 77 times, forgiving 10,000 talents, Jesus is saying that you can't measure any of this, so stop keeping track. We hear echoes of this in the story in the Old Testament from Joseph, where Joseph, experiencing this strange request for forgiveness, responds by saying, "Am I in the place of God? I'm not going to be in that place of retribution and judgment, figuring out the rights and wrongs that really finally belong to God." And when we come to that place, we realize that mercy is a verb. It's a verb. It's what we do. So what else keeps us from this transforming power of God's mercy? Perhaps it's our divided life. Maybe it's a spirituality that covers up the cracks in our lives and segregates our inward journey from our outward journey. When you think of Jesus' portrayal of the ungrateful servant, you see a person living a completely divided life with no insight into his wounds. His encounter, on one hand, with this extravagant mercy has no impact on how he relates then to others in the world. And here's the thing: the pain we don't name, we transmit. And that's exactly what he does to his fellow slave. Richard Rohr says, scapegoating, exporting our unresolved hurt, is the most common storyline of human history. And that's the storyline. That's the cycle which Jesus comes to break, and which we celebrate in a few moments here at this table. Now, I suspect some of you are wondering, well, Wes, what about accountability? What about crime and punishment? What about the criminal justice system? Well, I think this word has something to say to that as well. Because we're locked into a system of retributive justice, sin and evil demanding punishment, period. That's what works for our courts. That's what works in our prisons. That's even our approach to war. And more than that, we then are tempted to adopt a theological paradigm based on this threat of retribution and punishment. But doesn't the gospel offer another way? Doesn't the gospel say that sin and failure and damaging, hurtful actions also offer the opportunity for change, for transformation, for new life? In the end, as Jesus says, it's not an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Rather, the concern is for the restoration of relationship, for repair. And that requires an honest confrontation with the truth, with the hurt, the damage, the violation of others. There is accountability, not denial, but the goal is restoration. That was the genius of what Desmond Tutu did when he established the Commission on Truth and Reconciliation. One of the things that Karen and I admired so much here at Church of the Servant, for those of you engaged in prison ministry. And we saw and we're grateful for the amazing work that you continue to do. But out of that work, there also comes a thirst for restorative justice, for justice based not on retribution as much as on repair. And in fact, that movement now is beginning to make inroads within our larger criminal justice system. You can think of three frameworks. The first, don't forgive, punish, pay back, vengeance, and as even one of our former presidents would say, hit back harder. That's one way. Or you could say, forgive and forget. Just forgive and forget. But maybe there's a third way. Forgive and repair. Seek a transformed relationship to make whole again. A couple weeks ago, I was at a conference, and I listened to a young African-American woman who's doing amazing work in housing equity on the south side of Chicago. We were in a small group. Chanda Crispus Rouse was her name. And at one point, she stepped back and she said, we have to change our framework from what do I deserve to what do we owe one another? What do we owe one another? In our personal lives, in our social and political lives, we have to resist getting sucked into the system of revenge and retribution that dominates our social framework and that held the ungrateful servant captive. And we have to listen to this sort of strange ending to the parable, where I think Jesus is suggesting that finally a refusal to forgive another tortures us. Tortures us. Instead, we are invited to open and surrender ourselves to God's mercy and to allow that inner transformation to work its way into our souls so that we can release others, including even those who have hurt us the most, into the presence of that same mercy of God. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen.